I think, especially when I first started writing for others in the concert space, I was really nervous about what the performers were going to think or like what the audience was going to think. And it was very much like worried about just like what other people were thinking. And I feel like I very much had to tell myself, you got to let go of any expectations you have for that aspect of it. Like that really doesn't matter. All that matters is if you enjoy what you're creating. For me, that is actually really matters, because I've written some pieces where I was trying some really cool extended techniques or whatever, and then I like listen back and I'm like, this is just not me. It didn't feel like I was reaching deep within. And so I think letting go of expectations in that regard, but then also letting go of expectations when it comes to the actual creative process.
This is Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast from Loose Leaf Transmissions. What's up, y'all? Welcome to today's episode of the podcast. If this is your first time listening, it's sure nice to meet you. My name is Tyler. I'm a composer, radio broadcaster, podcaster, producer. Basically, I do a lot of different things, but mostly I'm just a maker. And on this podcast, I sit down with other makers to discuss their creative practice, artistic journey, and pretty much whatever it is that makes them who they are. So yeah, glad to have you here, and I encourage you to listen from the beginning of the podcast because there are so many great conversations so far. And of course, if you have been listening, it's great to see you again. On today's episode of Music Maker, I'm joined by composer, bassist, and vocalist Hannah Boissonneault. Hannah Jane Boissonneault is a composer, performer, and touring musician based in Austin, Texas. Through her work as a composer, bassist, and vocalist of her band Blank Slate and her multi-genre project Feels Like Honey, Hannah strives to create music that entwines the communities she is a part of. Hannah is endorsed by Balaguer Guitars, and she recently toured with Silent Planet as the bassist and clean vocalist in Spirit Breaker. She holds her Bachelor of Music in Composition from Michigan State University and her Master of Music in Composition from the University of Michigan. This was quite a fun conversation to record, and I'm really excited to share it with you. In it, Hannah shares the unique threads that came together for her when it was time for her to major in music composition, how she balances her work as a performer with being a composer, and how she does it across genre and style, and among other things, how she kind of feels that simply thinking about music is a valid part of the compositional process. Stick around, it's a great discussion, and I can't wait to share it with you. Just some housekeeping business to share before we jump into this conversation. One of the simplest and indeed truly the best way to support this podcast is by doing what you're doing now, listening to this episode, listening to earlier episodes, and then following the podcast on your favorite streaming platform. That'll ensure that you get the newest episode as soon as it's released and pushed straight to your device. Shout out to the Patreon fam. As we're recording this episode, we've got 20 amazing Patreon supporters who make this podcast possible, and you can join them, support what we're doing on Patreon, and you'll get early access to episodes by becoming a subscriber for just $5 a month. And yes, that little bit of support goes a long way in helping me cover the cost of some tools I use to produce this podcast. I also just launched a new Patreon exclusive feature about a month ago called The Workshop. That's sort of like an audio journal where I share a little bit about my own creative process related to some current composition projects that I'm working on. So you can find a Patreon link as well as additional ways to financially support the podcast on our website. That's at looseleaftransmissions.com/support. Finally, maybe the most impactful and bonus, it's a free way to help the Music Maker podcast, is by leaving a rating or even a review if you're able to, if you feel inclined. The more of those that we have, the more visibility the podcast has, and the more that we are able to grow the podcast. So if you can take just a few minutes to do that, especially leave a rating, it's just a click, right? You can do that on the podcast app that you're listening to this on right now. That's all I've got in that regard. On to my conversation with Hannah Boissonneault. Well, Hannah, I'm so excited to sit down with you. We were just talking a little bit before recording of how we've been in touch online and through social media, and it's been really great to kind of talk here and there over the past couple of years. But this is really our first time to sit down, and I'm excited to get to know you and hear more about your work, your journey, and just want to say thank you so much for your time today.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me. It's been so much fun connecting online and in social media and everything, and I'm so excited to get to know you more and to talk, and I'm really excited. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. So I like to begin as far back as you are really willing or able to go back in terms of your musical journey or creative journey. And so I'm wondering, what's your earliest artistic memory as a composer, as a musician, or even just as someone who makes things?
Yeah, I love this question because for me, I feel like kind of reflecting on the things I used to do when I was younger versus now, I feel like a lot of it comes pretty full circle for me. I started on piano. That was my first instrument, and I started when I was 9. And before I even began to learn how the instrument actually worked or how to perform or anything like that, I really just focused on writing as much as I could at the piano. I was really drawn to just making sounds and doing things and writing songs. And so I feel like my earliest memory of something that I created as a composer was just a piece that I wrote when I was I want to say probably 9 or something like that. But yeah, I really I was really drawn to just making music at an instrument and kind of improvising, I guess. I wouldn't have called it that back then, but yeah, that's how I started.
I talk with a lot of people who kind of share that sentiment as kids, and it's basically born out of I was bored with all the other stuff I had to play, the stuff I had to play as a pianist. Do you feel like it was that, or more of an extension of the music that you were learning and practicing and playing?
I feel like for me, it was actually more of this happened before I actually started playing my instrument. So I was really drawn to playing a thing and making sound, but I didn't actually know what I was doing at all. And I feel like honestly, that kind of defines my compositional journey as a whole, was I just kind of felt really drawn to making sounds. And still to this day, I feel like I don't know what I'm doing. I really enjoy it. I know what I'm doing a little bit more than I did back then. But I think the kind of creative freedom of just being able to sit at a thing and be no expectations, here's what I'm going to do. And I'm just going to play and see what happens is really how I started. And I think as I became more informed in how to play my instrument and everything, it really just helped me kind of keep exploring that idea as opposed to feeling confined in a box of oh, it has to sound a certain way or look a certain way.
Sure, yeah. How or where did you have access to this piano and other instruments growing up?
So it was my grandpa's old piano that my mom had taken back to her house once he passed away. And so it was really out of tune. It was really, really out of tune. And it was it had such awesome character. We tried to get it tuned when I was actually studying piano. But the people who were working on the instrument were this can't be fixed, sorry. And so I love the sound of that piano. We unfortunately got rid of it when I was older, but it was my favorite thing to just kind of sit and play on that piano. And yeah, I started taking lessons. I think when I was 9 is when I began.
So a lot of what you do today, in addition to being a composer, it seems like your primary musical performance activity is playing electric bass and singing, which we're going to get really deep into a little bit later on. But can you kind of connect the dots between the point that we're at now and when you were 9 years old, which is, I know, a long time? What was your musical journey like? Were you primarily a pianist throughout that time, or did you join a school ensemble or choir or something like that?
So I studied piano through, I think, from when I was 9 until when I was about 16 or so. I stopped taking lessons after that. I was really primarily interested in new age music at the time, film scores, that kind of thing. And so I was really drawn to that. And so I studied piano kind of formally, but also informally then. And then I also joined school orchestra when I was in 6th grade. So I started playing the violin actually for 5 years. My orchestra director would not let me switch to the bass, even though I played the electric bass. So we had too many bassists, and she also said my hands were too small, which I don't know. That's an interesting argument. But I actually switched to upright bass in high school. I think I was a junior, so it was really late. But I started playing bass when I was 12. And so really what I was primarily focused on during that time, I was in a school program that was actually, it was outside of school, called the School of Rock. I don't know if you're familiar with that program at all, but basically you learn how to play in bands, and it's essentially you learn how to play in bands and how to perform at a fast and higher level. So they have all different sorts of shows where you could play different genres of music, and they had an advanced band that often gigged every single weekend. And so we had to learn a lot of songs in the course of a couple months, and that was basically primarily how I met most of the people I still play with today, and also the bands that I was involved in school and everything. So kind of connecting those three things, the school orchestra was kind of more of my, I guess, classical roots, and then the School of Rock was more of connected to what I do today.
Yeah, that's so cool. When would you say your first encounter with a composer was?
Oh my gosh, I was thinking about this question because I had to think back. I wasn't actually sure. And then I remembered when I was a senior in high school, we actually had a composer visit for the first time with our orchestra because we were performing at the Michigan Music Conference, I believe is what it was called. I don't actually remember the formal name of the conference, but we were performing one of his pieces at this conference, and he flew out to come see us. And that was the first time I'd ever actually been in a room with a composer.
Yeah.
And it was really cool. It was fun. His name is Richard Meyer. I think he is the strings editor for Alfred Music, and he's a string composer. But yeah, I mean, that was my first ever experience of being in a room with another composer, which to me feels a little bit late almost when I was thinking back, but it was pretty informative.
Were you composing a lot at that point as a high schooler, as a senior in high school? Did that, I don't know, was that experience of meeting Richard Meyer exciting for you because you got to meet a composer, play his music, and get feedback, or maybe did it go a little bit deeper than that?
I mean, it was really exciting, I think, because it was the first time of seeing someone that was doing that thing as their career in front of me, because I had always known about film composers and that kind of music and everything, but those composers feel very far away when it comes to being in front of somebody who's actually doing the thing. And so that was one of the first times I'd actually been in a room with somebody doing that for their career, and that was really inspiring to me. And I think it was really helpful to kind of think about what I wanted to do going forward, because I was composing a decent amount at this time. I actually had just taken it was a music theory class. I think it was AP music theory or something. And the teacher that I had for that class, I think he assigned us, it was either an arranging assignment or a composing assignment. I think we had both of those throughout the semester. And we got to learn how to use finale and everything like that. And so that was my first music DAW kind of exposure as well. So I think once I took that class, he was the first classical mentor I had that was hey, you should consider doing this. If you really if you want to do this, you should consider there are options for you. You can go to school. I can connect you with people I know that are at such and such university. And I was no one's ever said that to me before, That's so cool. I didn't even know that was an option. And so that was the first semester, or I honestly don't remember if we had trimesters or semesters, but that was the first part of the year. And then the second part of the year, I had talked to my orchestra director because she was not the person who was teaching the AP theory class. I think that was our band director, and I wasn't really involved. I wasn't in band. And so I talked to my orchestra teacher, and I was like, hey, I'm really considering doing this. Can you help me? And can we work on this together? And unfortunately, her response was I don't know if you're instrumentally proficient enough to get into such and such schools that you're interested in. But, she did let me do an independent study where I just got to compose and kind of try to make a portfolio. She helped me in that way. And so I didn't actually end up auditioning for music school as a undergrad, like until I want to say, yeah, it was halfway through my freshman year is when I actually auditioned for like the music program at Michigan State. I was already there. Long-winded answer.
No, that's awesome. It's like kind of shocking to me that your teacher was so blunt. I'm kind of sitting here
Yeah.
like, whoa, that's a little intense. So what did you major in? I mean,
Yeah. I think I started, oh my gosh, it was a long journey. I started with, I think, political science. I was like, maybe I'll go to law school or something. And then I switched over to English because I was like really interested in creative writing at the time. And I think it was August of going into my freshman year that I did decide like I do want to look into doing music composition. And I was pretty set on that, but it had already been too late. I had passed the audition time and everything, and I didn't even, I think at that time I was, for a lot of different reasons, I was kind of like trying to close the chapter of music for me because I just didn't believe that I could do it. I didn't believe that I was like good enough to get into those schools. And so I was like, I'll just try again later. And so I think, yeah, it was August, and I decided to walk into the chair of the composition department at Michigan State's office, and I asked him if we could have a meeting, and I kind of told him about my background and everything, and I showed him some music that I had written, and he was like, we can absolutely help you,
yeah.
create a portfolio. Like, you can take lessons, your first semester here, and we can help you audition for the program. And I took piano lessons actually because this was the biggest hurdle of getting into the school was the instrument. And so my orchestra teacher from high school was correct. It was definitely, a challenge in that regard. But at the time, no one had mentioned like or thought of the option of looking into the jazz department or anything. Just because I played electric bass, I was really proficient at that. That was my instrument, but we just didn't have a like space for that in the classical department there. Or, I mean, the jazz department, yes, but it was mostly upright jazz, like traditional jazz bass. And so I auditioned on the piano, and I was denied from the piano studio, but accepted into the composition studio. So it was a little bit of a hurdle, but I truly owe like most of I owe Rodney Whitaker so much in my life because he was such a wonderful mentor to me. But Rodney Whitaker, who is the director of jazz studies at Michigan State, he let me audition for him on electric bass. And he was the first person that told me, he was like, you can do this. Anyone can do this music. And I believe in you and I want you in my studio. And so he helped me, create an option for playing the jazz bass in school, but then also being able to study classical composition.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's such an interesting confluence of threads that came together to make it possible. I mean, for those who have listened to the podcast for since I've started, basically, I mean, almost half the composers, I would say, I mean, they would say their first composition experience actually would be like playing in a rock band with their friends, coming
Yes.
up with writing songs. And something I want to talk about with you when we get there is kind of
Yes.
this classical versus non-classical, well, existence for you, but also kind of almost like the stigmas in our culture, which can be a huge bummer sometimes for me. But I'd like to focus a little bit, almost back up some, and focus on your background as a performer. What drew you to the bass? Because you said you started playing when you were 12 years old. And when did you first become interested in kind of the genres that you currently work in? I'm thinking like math rock, which is a favorite genre of mine,
So good.
progressive metalcore, all these kinds of really kind of complex rock styles.
I think going back to how I started on the bass, my dad is like a huge metalhead. So he showed me a lot of the metal music that I was kind of introduced to when I was younger. One of my favorite bands growing up was Iron Maiden and Black Sabbath. And so he was the first person to kind of introduce listening to the bass for me because I knew I loved that music. But he was like, listen, a little bit deeper and you can hear like all of these different layers. And he was like, you should listen for the bass. It's the cool one. And I was like, okay. But I did. And I think that was my first kind of like baby introduction to like deep listening as a person and as a creative. And I loved the bass and I loved Steve Harris specifically. He's like one of my biggest bass idols growing up. And so that band specifically was what really got me into starting the bass. I didn't know anything about it other than I was like, I want to do that. That's what I want to do. And so I started playing and teaching myself in the beginning. And then I took lessons at the School of Rock. And it was really fun and awesome. But I would say like there was a solid couple years in my life where I was really into Black Sabbath as well. That was like another metal starting band for me. And even to this day, I always say like Geezer Butler's bass playing is just a part of my bass playing at this point. Like I was very, very influenced by his playing. And I still feel like to this day that a lot of my influence is directly related to that time in my life where I was just constantly practicing Black Sabbath songs. I didn't really start getting into, well, I was into math rock for a long time and like progressive music, but I didn't really start getting into like really heavy metal until a couple years ago. I joined a like progressive metalcore band based out of Michigan. They were called Spirit Breaker, and that was my first experience touring as well in that genre. And it was very outside of my comfort zone when I joined the band. They really needed a bassist and they were hoping that, you know, we could work together. And I was like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to try something new. I love playing and I love playing metal. I've never played this, you know, heavy of a style of metal, but I was excited. And it took a little bit for me to like get behind screaming. I feel like that's always the first thing that people in general that listen to metal, like that's the first kind of hurdle. And for me, that did take some time, but I've always been exposed to it and adore it. My fiance is like really into that kind of music as well. He definitely came around to it way earlier than me, but because of him and because of like joining that band and being able to just like freely express myself in that space and see how amazing it is, now I listen to like the heaviest of heavy metal. Like I really love screaming. I love breakdowns. I love super low tunings. There's a lot of really, really cool experimental stuff happening right now in metal. And I feel like it's one of the most like, I don't know, this is a kind of a cliche word, but like it's really groundbreaking in a lot of ways. There's so many exciting things happening. And I feel like, I don't know, that genre is very, very special to me. And I really miss playing it like live all the time. It's so much fun.
Yeah, I'm one of those people. The vocals are a hurdle for me, but
Yeah.
I feel like this is a rabbit trail that we can go deep down, and I'm happy to do that because
Yeah.
there's so much to talk about. You know, I actually grew up playing bass, and electric bass specifically. I was never good at bowing.
Same.
And
I feel that.
And I could never play guitar because I have really fat fingers and like the dexterity wasn't there. But I was always drawn to more progressive styles. You know, I'm thinking as far back as like Yes and Rush,
Mm-hmm.
and like hearing those bass lines as a young bass player and being like, oh, like this is actually like, it's not just like, you know, holding down the fort. It's like there's actually like athleticism to this. And like, that's
Yes.
always the kind of stuff that, and now I listen to a lot of like, do you know the band Elephant Gym?
I don't.
So it's a Taiwanese math rock band where
Okay.
it's kind of like almost borderline jazz, but it is math rock, and the bass player is a female vocalist too. Like
Oh my
she's
gosh.
doing all of these like just really incredible moving bass lines while singing and time signatures that are like don't belong together, and it's. But anyway, I digress.
I need to check them out. I'm excited now.
Yeah,
I'm
Elephant
gonna have a list
Gym
after this.
and Trico. A lot. I listen to a lot of like math rock from Asia. So, but you know, when I think back to the bass players that I looked up to or modeled my playing after, you know, they were all men. At least I can't think of. I mean, I just acknowledged a lady bass player, but you know, when I think back to that time in my life, I can't think of a lady bass player that I was aware of at that time. So I'm sure this is something that you've had to confront and think about. Can you talk about this a little bit from your perspective, and maybe what representation means to you when it comes to being a female bassist?
Yeah, oh my gosh, that's a great question because I feel like when I think back to my idols when I was growing up, they were definitely not women. They were mostly all, men. And recently, I've kind of realized the importance of representation just in, yes, while being a bassist, but also being in the metal community. That is a community that definitely does not have enough representation.
Oh, of
um,
course.
but I think this is not something I really thought about until probably the last like 5 years or so. Just being in a room and knowing that, oh, like I'm the only woman playing in this whole lineup of like 20, 25 musicians or whatnot. And I feel like for me, just being aware of all of the amazing women and musicians that like surround me. Like I have so many idols in that world, specifically in bass, but also just in, the different styles of music that I listen to itself, and just being able to see like, oh, there's someone else that looks like me or relates to my experiences in a way that, some people cannot in this space. And I think that's so important. And I feel like, especially in the, classical music community, that really, there are a lot of women that I really, really look up to there. But being in bands, that is very rare. That happens a
Yeah.
little bit less frequently, especially, as like in the metal community. So for me, representation is like really important. And I feel like one of my biggest aspirations is just to be, able to inspire a young bassist someday that wants to play the instrument and is interested, that identifies as a woman. That is one of my biggest aspirations, is to be able to inspire other young women bassists out there.
Yeah. Have you had an experience like that so far?
I have actually. I played a show and I'm trying to remember what year. I believe in 2022 or 2021. It was probably 2021. I was on tour with Spirit Breaker, and this was in the middle of Lubbock, Texas, so very, very remote area. We had about 5 people at the show. It was very awesome. But the opening band that played for us was like a band that was in high school, and they were, it was a fun experience because we're this like screaming metalcore band, and they were playing like all these classic 80s rock stuff, and they had their own original music, and they were really, really good musicians. And yeah, the bassist of that band was awesome. And she was a really great bassist. And she, came up to the show after and she was like, I really, I don't really see a lot of bands that have women bassists. And she actually like said that to me, and she took a picture with me, and it was fun. And I think that was the first time I've ever had that happen, actually.
That's great. So I think we're going to be probably bouncing back and forth between not really your two identities, but the two different worlds that you have your feet in. So I want to get back to your journey as a composer. When did you know that you wanted to pursue the craft of composition as a career?
I have an informal answer and then I have a formal answer. I would say the informal answer is I've always wanted to be like a composer. I guess I say that with quotations because I wasn't really sure like what kind of composer. But when I was really, really young, I used to listen to like Pandora radio all the time. That was my introduction to like new age classical music. And I loved it, and I loved the idea of being a film composer. That was what I really wanted to do when I was, I think probably 9 and up was when I really started thinking in that kind of almost like pipe dream way. And then the formal answer would be, I believe when I was around 18 and I decided that I wanted to like study it in school. That was the moment when I realized like, yes, I want to do this for a career, and I will, pursue this as much as I can and see where it goes. And there were a lot of kind of realizations that came with that, and ways that that path has changed for me, because in the beginning I was definitely set on pursuing film, and now I would say I am more in the concert music space, and I really prefer being in the concert music and I guess performance space that are slightly outside of that
Sure.
realm. But yeah, I would say when I was 18 and I was really considering studying it in school is when I really decided.
What do you think caused that shift? Because I feel like we all kind of, as composers, have that entry point of where, oh, I want to be a film composer, I want to be a video game music composer, like, those those kinds of inspirations, and then I guess we kind of get into school and it's like that's when it changes. I mean, was that kind of the case for you, or did you have you had an experience composing for film?
Yeah. Yeah, I did compose for some student films and some films that were directed by the university. And I mean, I really enjoyed that process. I think it was more of the fact that a lot of my mentors that I really looked up to there were not as involved in film. And the career path of film itself, the older I got and the more involved in the academic space that I was in, that's when I kind of decided to sort of pivot to concert music. But it wasn't necessarily driven by just kind of the environment of the music, but I think also I loved writing longer concert pieces. And I was really interested, and I still am really interested in kind of this meditative compositional space. And I think that could lend well to film music in some regard. And then in other regards, I just feel like the two paths are pretty different. And pursuing the two paths they at least feel different to me as a career. It seems like the film track is really, really fast paced and really, really involved in, creating demo reels and everything.
Right.
And that kind of fast paced creativeness for me, it doesn't usually happen like that. And that's kind of when I was like, well, maybe I should just explore the concert music space.
Yeah, I totally feel that. I'd imagine that all of the different kinds of music that you do make, they are equally integral to your creative work, like kind of in a holistic way. But how do you find balance among them all? I mean, how do you decide what to prioritize and when to prioritize it?
Yeah, I feel like this is a part of almost like a wider conversation as well, because for the longest time, I viewed them as very separate. They were very separate things. And I was constantly trying to figure out like how to make them not separate, but I couldn't, at least when I was younger, I couldn't really figure out why I felt they were so separate. Because now I feel like they're just, like you said, they're an integral, just part of the whole. They're part of who I am. And both of those spaces, or however many spaces, I guess we could say, they all just feel kind of like the same experience to me. But when I was in school, it felt very different. And I felt like the concert music that I was writing, that experience felt extremely different from the, music that I was creating with my band. And I haven't really mentioned this, but my fiance and I are in a band together, and we started that band also when I went to college. So during that time, we were writing all of the music together in this collaborative space. And then I was also writing my own solo concert works, and it just felt like a very different kind of isolating experience for me. And so I knew I loved both spaces. Like I knew I really loved being a concert composer, and I also loved, writing in bands and the collaborative efforts. And so I really spent most of my time in undergrad and even my master's, like trying to figure out like, why do I feel like these things are so separate, you know? And I feel like I have an answer to that, but now I feel like it's just been a lot of time and healing and and taking time for myself to kind of define like what those spaces kind of mean for me. But now like balancing them, it feels a lot easier because I think I view it more as phases of life.
Yeah.
Like I view the spaces as, in this phase of life right now, for example, I'm really interested in growing as a bassist. I'm interested in growing as a performer and playing and touring as much as I can. The feeling of being on stage for me as a bassist is one of the most fulfilling and exciting things for me. And I've realized like it doesn't matter if I'm playing a cover gig, it doesn't matter if I'm playing a wedding gig, it doesn't matter if I'm playing someone else's music, it doesn't matter if I'm playing my own music, although that's probably my favorite is to play my own music. None of those things matter to me. What really feels the most me as a performer is just being on the stage and sharing like a musical space with other people. And I think once I realized that, which was definitely during the pandemic when I wasn't able to be doing that. I studied at with or I studied my master's at University of Michigan during the pandemic. And so I was still able to compose as much as possible. And I had all the time, like endless time, because we weren't able to go outside or see our people. And I had all of this time to compose, and I couldn't write anything because I just really was thinking about, wow, I really miss being on stage. I
Yeah.
miss this part of me that I can't believe I, was kind of pushing aside all this time, because I would say that when I was in college, my phase of life then was definitely prioritizing concert music and prioritizing that kind of creation and collaboration in whatever way, which I love and I still to this day love. But I realized during the pandemic that I really also love being a performer, and I didn't feel like I could identify as both things at the time. And now I'm just doing as much as I can with as much with as much time as I have. But I would say currently in this phase of life, I'm definitely prioritizing, being a performer and collaborating with others. Songwriting is a huge part of what I'm really interested in right now. And I just finished up a consortium for solo trumpet, which has been so much fun to be a part of. And that's the most recent concert music work I've had in a long time. And I almost was expecting that process to feel like a little foreign because it's been a little bit since I've actually written a concert piece. It's been probably around a year or so since I've had a last commission. So I was not entirely sure how the process would feel for me, but it felt the same, which was really, really
Yeah.
great. I was so glad. But yeah, I would say phases of life for me, for sure.
I mean, what you're describing resonates with me so much because even though I'm not a performer, I have so much other activity outside of composing music, sitting down and writing
Right.
music. And it feels like a struggle sometimes. Like I feel like there's a pressure to like constantly be producing music, like, oh, you're only a composer if you are sitting there writing music, getting it performed, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
Although the performance of your music as a composer hopefully ends up being something more passive.
Right.
But I'm kind of with you, like shifting into the idea of maybe for me not phases of life, but more just viewing all of my work as like kind of a wheel with like a common hub, and the hub is me, right?
Exactly.
And it's, if yeah, I've put less pressure on myself personally to produce music, a lot of music, and it might be, like you said, it might be a year between each big project that I do, but I don't know, I think that's something that's important, and that's something that I also feel like being in academic programs doesn't really get talked about.
No. And also I just want to touch on what you just said because I think that's the perfect way to phrase it. The wheel and having, different interests at different times, but being able to really reference the one thing that's driving it, which is you. I mean, all of the work you do is incredible, and I feel like being able to balance it all is really difficult, but it's important, and all of the work that you do is important.
Yeah, I kind of tangential to this conversation. I often feel like, for better or for worse, maybe for worse, there's this maybe like a cultural or even societal delineation between classical musicians and other types of musicians like
Yes.
jazz or rock or folk people, or whatever. In your experience, what do other classical musicians in your orbit think of these other genres and styles that you work in? And I guess inversely, what do your bandmates think about your activity as a quote unquote capital C composer?
I feel like the answer to this would have been different like a few years ago versus now. I think that most of my friends that are in this classical space are really excited about other styles of music and honestly have given me a list of music to check out myself. And a lot of times my friends are, doing so much research and are really involved in just finding out as much as they can about a thing. So finding out as much as they can about other genres. And I feel like I learned so much from them in that way. So I would say for the most part, it's a really positive perspective that they have. And I feel like I can learn a lot from them as well. And, in the past, there was definitely more of that divide, I feel like. And I say in the past, but I really feel like it might just be my time in academia versus not
Yeah.
being in academia. And it's not to the fault of any style or thing, but there just is a very big divide between different styles. I mean, it's how that the programs are built. It's who is specializing in what and who wants to teach that thing. And so I always struggled with being in school and being like, why are there no people that can teach you how to like be in a band ensemble or whatever? But really, it's just like, okay, if you want to do that, you go to a school that specializes in that. And I just didn't really, that wasn't an option for me at the time. I was like, I'm going to Michigan State. I'm already here. I'm already a year in. Like and my mentors there were so supportive of the other things that I did. But at the same time, you have to write such and such amount of music, or you have to complete whatever. My program was very flexible. We didn't have juries. We didn't have any quota on how much music we needed to write, but I was writing as much as I could. And so I would say the perspective has shifted a lot. And a lot of times I have a lot of friends that come to me now and they're really interested in exploring other styles of music, and they ask me, they're like, I just don't know how you do it. I don't know how you are in this other space. Like, how did you break away from the classical space? And I've never really been away from it, so it's harder
Right.
for me to answer that question for them because I can only imagine, I mean, just the feelings that I had trying to identify as a capital C composer, which I never felt like I fit in, by the way, ever. I was always constantly trying to like catch up to my peers or feel like, and then when I say catch up, I mean just an understanding of the language, because I really felt like I had a lot of avenues in the, I guess, capital C classical route that I wanted to really get better at. For example, score, presentation, or even just being able to communicate what's in my brain versus like what I hear here versus what I have on the page. Like, that was a huge issue for me. I'm very much a improviser and like a transcriber. That is kind of how my brain works. And so I think there were just a lot of things that I felt like I wanted to improve on that I could lean on my classical capital C trained friends for. And so now, yeah, it's interesting that I find more and more that there are people that are in that space that are really struggling to get out of it or trying to, find ways to be a part of different spaces. And I always just say, like, just be yourself and like do what is calling to you, and try to find people in that community that you can either look up to or be friends with or create with, because it's really, in my opinion, really all about like community and having a community of people in those spaces that you can look up to, kind of going back to the representation thing, and also just being able to create with people.
Yeah. Oh, it's so important. I mean, it can't be overstated, and I think, as someone who I'm a very academic thinker. I'll admit that, but I'm not a
Which is
huge
amazing.
well, but I'm not a huge fan of academia though, for all the reasons you're describing. That it like, what you're saying about like you had trouble getting into the composition department because you like didn't have instrumental proficiency to the degree they wanted you to have. Like like you're experiencing that. You're not the only person who's had to deal with that.
Definitely not.
That's common across the board, and that's like so frustrating because like if you, as a composer, if you ask me to get up and perform something in front of an audience tomorrow, I wouldn't be able to do it. You know what I mean? So
It's a very different skill set, and I feel like it's sad to me that, and I understand why there are institutional barriers. Like, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I understand why, but I feel like, you know, it was just it's a lot of stress on a young person just trying to fit into something, and I feel like even just as composers, like you said, I mean, it's a completely different skill set, and you spend so much time learning about performers and learning about what things they can do, and I feel like that's just so different from being a performer as well. But at the same time, they're pretty integrated, I guess. But they're so different, and to expect like a young person at the age of 17, 18
Right,
or
right.
whatever to like be like proficient at a classical instrument, that's just putting a lot of barriers on people that either didn't have access to that or are interested in more than one thing, you know?
Yeah. I'm so glad though that you currently have a positive experience with your classical friends, the way they do what you do, and that you were able to find a mentor at Michigan. So
Oh my gosh, yeah. I've owe a lot of my like current creative practice to the mentors that I've had both there and like especially Michigan State. Like the mentors I had there are just I owe a lot to them for sure.
how do your ventures in non-classical music inform the work that you do as a composer and vice versa? Because I'm sure that as active as you are in both spaces and as formally educated as you are in contemporary composition, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of interesting things that happen in your work.
Yeah, I love this question because I also feel like my answer 5 years ago would have been so different. And I say that a lot because I feel like I had mentioned earlier that I spent so much time just like trying to figure out what the divide was in the music that I wrote and why it felt so different. And now it feels so not. It feels so it flows nicely and I'm
Yeah.
glad that I've reached that point. But I feel like for me it really was like looking deep within myself and kind of figuring out like okay, what things are threads here? And I think I really love collaboration. It's like one of my favorite things ever. I love writing songs with other people, and that's truly like my favorite form of art making. I feel like is the collaborative space with another songwriter. But when it comes to my concert work and the other stuff that I do, I would say recently I feel like I've found more of a thread between those things. And so the music that I like writing, like the concert music that I like enjoy writing, I write a lot of fixed media and I usually integrate my vocal writing or my actual voice and my guitar tracks and different things into the fixed media. And so I usually like integrate a performance element into the fixed media that I record. And it's so much fun because I can just make like a wall of sound thing. That's like my favorite thing to do right now is just make a really large multi-tracked wall of sound that's kind of meditative and flowy and whatnot. And I would say the last, I don't know, several pieces I've written have kind of incorporated that. And when it comes to the actual writing process, and I just realized this recently, like they're both kind of exactly the same for me. When I wrote my album that I released back in October, I was just kind of reflecting and thinking back, like, what happened? How did I do this? And a lot of times I just open up my phone, I get a voice memo, and I improvise. And that whole improvisation is just the song. Like, typically, I don't, which is very, I feel like, contradictory to what I've been taught and a lot of what my friends do, but I feel like I don't make a lot of changes after that first improvisation that
Yeah.
I actually like connect with. Of course, I will sit and do 20, 30 of them on my phone until I feel like I found the right thing. Or I'll sit there for, 2 hours until I feel like I've really gotten in the flow of it. But typically I sit down and I improvise either on piano, which I am not a good pianist and it makes me excited because I actually feel like I can find things that I like enjoy or wouldn't have found if I was a good pianist. So that's it's fun to approach an instrument with like a sort of like childlike curiosity almost, like kind of going back to that experience of like being 9 and playing the piano and not knowing what I was doing kind of thing. I do the same thing with guitar as well. I play guitar and I play piano. I know I do, but that's not like my actual professional instrument. So it feels like a fun way to explore something different. And now I've really been into like starting with guitar with all my songwriting. I usually start with some form of fun pitch shift, weird guitar effect. But yeah, I think, and even in my concert composing, same exact process. I improvise on the piano and then I transcribe it or think of it in the lens of the actual instrumentation I'm writing for. But that's usually my process every single time. And with composition or, the concert music, I definitely do make a lot of changes. Like that first improvisation is nothing like the actual final score. But typically with my songwriting, it's very similar to the first improvisation. I can always track a song back to the first thing that I improvised on my phone, like from years ago or whatever. And I'm like, oh, it's like the same thing. That's pretty cool. But yeah, I would say that's how both of those things relate for my process.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to me because it's so different from the way that I personally work, and
Can you
I'm so
explain your process? I'm so interested. I'm sorry. I know I know you're supposed to be interviewing me, but I'd love to hear more about it.
no, yeah. Let me think about this for a second because no one's ever asked me this on the podcast for sure. I approach it almost like with a sense of craftsmanship. Like I want everything in a piece to have some sort of like uniformity or
Mm.
like a thread that connects it all in some way. Like I think a lot about like an efficiency of means. But that being said, almost everything begins like me improvising on the piano in a lot of ways, whether that's a chord progression or like a little melody or something. And then I imagine the sorts of gestures and textures that I want in the piece. I will like draw very terrible kinds of
Yes.
blueprints for that, and then try to like smash it all together. And then the piece that I'm working on right now is a solo piano piece, and I've been working on it for 2 years, not consistently, like kind of really off and on. And I've spent so much time just like listening measure by measure and like making little tiny adjustments. And that's like kind of a new thing. Like I'm not in a hurry. I'm just like trying to get it exactly perfect, whatever that means to my intuition, right?
That's so cool.
So yeah, I've never been like the voice memo person, but I will, like, if I have a notebook, I'll like draw like a crappy drawing of what I want the music to sound like or something.
Yeah.
So
That's so cool.
yeah,
Yeah, it's so different. Like I feel like for me it was all about like, oh, like what sounds am I hearing and like it's mostly I'm a very harmonically driven person and I
sure,
also
yeah,
love like slow moving harmony things. So like if I can stay on the same chord for an entire piece, I will. Like I love that kind of stuff. But it's so different. Like I don't usually think of anything visually and I think I love like hearing other artists and how they create things because for me I wouldn't like go to write it down, but like I've tried to do like a graphic score or like a sort of kind of diagram and it works sometimes, but usually I look at it and I'm like, "Oh, this looks is totally like nothing like what I actually made." So I feel like I can't connect it visually like what I hear visually, which I think that's the going back to the score, the sort of like wanting to have a visual score that represents like what I hear in my brain. That was very hard for me, like growing up and learning that. So yeah, I found that really really awesome.
no, I mean, it takes a lot of practice, like anything else, right? I have to say though, hearing the way your different, I guess, musical projects kind of inform each other, hearing what you have to say about that, I have to point out that when I first listened to your album, All Things Endless, which for those who want to listen to it, it's the artist name is Feels Like Honey, but that's you. So
Yes, thank
so
you.
you'll want to look for Feels Like Honey, All Things Endless. When I first listened to your album, the first track I'm listening to it and I'm like, this could be like on an electroacoustic concert. And I'm like,
Ah,
I was like,
yeah.
I kind of went in with no expectations. And I was like, oh, is this what the album's going to be? And then the second track plays and it's like more in that kind of pop rock
Mhm.
vein. And I'm like, this is awesome. And so like the flow that you're talking about through your different, the way you incorporate everything into different things, different types of music, I like picked up on that right away. So it's really awesome to hear you like describe it yourself. And
I'm so glad. Oh my gosh, that makes me very happy.
yeah, so I'll have a link to your website and where people can listen to your stuff in the show
Thanks.
notes as with everyone else. So I'm sure that we've kind of touched on this in our conversation so far a little bit, but I want to ask you more directly about kind of your philosophies and your aesthetics and kind of the way you kind of the nuts and bolts way of how you approach your work. And so, what would you describe as the primary pillars of your creative practice?
I came up with a few of them. The first one that I thought of instantly was just letting go of all expectations. I think, especially when I first started writing for others in the concert space, I was really nervous about what the performers were going to think or like what the audience was going to think. And it was very
Oh,
much
yeah.
like worried about just like what other people were thinking. And I feel like I very much had to tell myself, you got to let go of any expectations you have for that aspect of it. Like, that really doesn't matter. All that matters is if you enjoy what you're creating. For me, that is actually really matters, because I've written some pieces where I was trying some really cool extended techniques or whatever. And then I like listen back and I'm like, this is just not me. It didn't feel like I was reaching deep within. And so I think letting go of expectations in that regard, but then also letting go of expectations when it comes to the actual creative process, especially when you have like a deadline. I feel like it's really scary to think about, oh, okay, my deadline's coming up in 2 weeks and I have nothing on the page. What am I going to do? I have
Yeah.
been in that position.
Oh, yeah, me too.
I'm sure everyone has, but yeah, it is not a fun position to be in. And I feel like, I'm sorry, this is kind of a ramble. I apologize. But it kind of ties into my entire process as a whole as of recently, because when I was in school, I very much relied on anxiety to push me through to the deadline, and procrastination as well. I was very like, I procrastinated the actual piece for a very long time. And then it wasn't until recently that I realized it wasn't actually procrastination. I was thinking about the piece basically every moment of every time that I had a moment to think about the piece. And it was being written in my brain while I was thinking about it, which sounds silly, but I feel like a lot of composers don't give themselves credit for like thinking and the time that we need away, you
Yeah,
know?
well, I don't want to interrupt because I want you to keep going, but I just want to say what you just said is so important and was like a realization for me too, that again going back to like as composers there's so much pressure, especially from like in academic institutions, to produce
Yes.
produce, like, get your stuff out there. I mean, the algorithms kind of put pressure on us too in a lot of ways.
Yes.
But this idea of like, actually I can be composing without anything, without any tool, just like my brain. And
Yes.
that was such a game changer shift in perspective for me personally. So you're asking about my process. That's a big part of my process actually too.
Yes. Staying away from the page and just like living your life. I feel like that, like, it's it's such a game changer for me, at least, because I just really thought that I was procrastinating. I really thought that I had nothing in there. And then all of a sudden, the 2-week deadline comes and I'm like, I have a whole piece. Where did this even come from? It just appeared. But really, it was, months of sitting there and thinking about what you want. And I feel like, it's really, I feel like it's important that people know that that is a part of the process, because looking back at like younger me, I was so hard on myself for being that way and like, being fueled by anxiety for sure. And I think now, I mean, especially just my work life, my day-to-day work life looks so different than it did back in school, but
Yeah.
I really feel like even when it comes to songwriting, like it's the same exact thing for me. I think about a song for a very long time. I usually have that one improvisation or one recording, and then I just go back to it months, maybe a year later. I mean, it could be a long time. It could be a couple weeks, just depending on what the scope of when you want to finish the thing is. But you go back and you know exactly what you want. And that's because you spent so much time with it, in your brain. And I don't know, that's that's I had to let go of the expectation that like every day I would write like however many measures or whatever, because that's just not, that doesn't work for everybody. So that's my first pillar. I'm so sorry.
No,
I'll
that's
just
awesome.
list the rest of them.
No,
Um,
let's dig in.
the second one I had was just encouraging play. So like, encouraging, just allowing yourself to like play with the music and have fun. Because I always thought it was so serious, it has to be a serious thing. I think the improvisatory process for me is just a part of that. But then the next one I had was don't be afraid of leaning into something familiar. And I think this one was like a huge one for me, because It still is. I mean, I feel like in the same harmonic sound world for the last like 5 years. Like, I just love the same kinds of chords. I love the same meditative, like flowy spaces. And I think in school, a lot of the time, and I mean, this could still be true. It's just been a while since I've been in school. So I feel like I was, encouraged to try different things and different styles. And when I say styles, I guess I mean like, just making sure that every piece doesn't sound exactly the same.
Right.
And so I feel like, I don't know, that was something I was always really concerned about, is like, oh, all of my pieces sound the same. Like, what do I do? What if I do if they all sound exactly the same? And I feel like, you know, for me, I still am allowed to be in that same sound world that I'm really excited about, but I do usually try something a little bit different each time. So it's kind of like reconciling that for me, but allowing yourself to just be in something that's familiar if you want to be. Like if it's a goal for you to go completely outside of your comfort zone, which is like the next one that I have, is trying something new, or going outside of your comfort zone is also equally as important. And that doesn't have to be like something crazy, like, writing a piece in a completely different style from what you're used to that you don't even know if you enjoy, or like an instrumentation that maybe will never get performed because it's so crazy or something. Like, you don't have to make it that extreme. You can if you want. It's a fun exercise, it's a fun experiment, but I think knowing that you're trying something new or trying to go a little bit outside of your comfort zone from the last time you wrote something is important to me, at least in my practice. So those are what I came up with.
No,
Sorry.
I love that last point, and I have to say that one of the most important statements about composing, and again, this important to me, your mileage may vary. One of the most important statements that I just kind of overheard someone say about another composer, and this other composer said this about their body of work in general, and that's it's all just one big piece, and
Yes.
and that, like, to me, that unlocks something like kind of what you're talking about, where again, it takes that pressure off of like reinventing the wheel every time. And so, ever since I heard that, I think about each piece as like just an extension of the one that came before it. And yes, I want it to be like a little more mature. I want it to be a little more in a certain direction, maybe, but taking that pressure off. That again, it's pressure that like we kind of pick up from academia for better or for worse. I think it does serve a purpose then, but once you kind of grow up, and I'm doing air quotes there, once you grow up, you're allowed to, well, like what you're saying, kind of live with what you want to live with and do with it what you want to do with it. So I appreciate that.
I feel like it's so important because a lot of people always talk about like and I'm also saying this in quotations, finding your sound. Like, I feel like that's like the one question that everyone asks, like, how do you find your sound? And it's like, I don't even know if that's real. The concept of that, I feel like I could unpack that for a while, but I feel like it's mostly like you said, it's just viewing your art making as a continuation instead of oh, this is a new piece, this is a new instrumentation, this is a new ensemble, this is a completely new thing that I have to do each time. I feel like not viewing it as a blank slate, which is funny because my band is called Blank Slate, but not viewing it as a blank slate is important. It helps you kind of be in touch with who you are, because I feel like a lot of composing is who we are. Like, it's very much a self-identification of who we are. So I feel like that's important.
No, I mean, you're talking about these pillars kind of through the lens of being a composer. I'm sure that it also manifests in your work with, I mean, being in a band is more collaborative,
Yeah.
songwriting and whatnot. I mean, do you, as either as a band with your bandmates or just your own kind of influence over that process, do you feel the same way as you do with your individual compositions for the concert stage?
I definitely do. I feel like, I mean, collaboration is such a special thing, because I feel like a lot of those kind of pillars just aren't talked about, but they just appear. They just happen naturally, which is why I love. I mean, I know that most of the time it happens naturally without having to think about it on the solo aspect of things or being a capital C composer, but I feel like even just thinking back to like the band that I just referenced, Blank Slate, that's my fiance and I's band. And we've been playing together since we were 14, but we've been writing together since we were, I want to say we started it when we were 17. And it's been a long time, basically.
Yeah.
And even then, like just viewing our creative process back then versus now, it's so different. And it's because we kind of changed as artists and as collaborators. I've always been a very collaborative, like let's jam it out person. I love that kind of collaboration, but my fiance was more of a kind of like solo writer who would come to these practices and have a full fleshed out finished song. And at the time, I feel like well, I wrote my album because I didn't know if I could write a full song. Like I really it was almost like a challenge to me to like write a full, which sounds so silly at like looking back, but it was a challenge to myself to be able to write like a full, song with all the instrumentations and things I wanted to do that I felt like I was a little bit insecure about writing because I've always in a collaborative setting, the drummer writes the drummer's parts, the guitarist writes the guitarist parts, I write my parts, and that's how it goes usually. And writing my album was like a test to like, can I do this myself? Like, could I actually do all of those things? And I did, and now I feel really comfortable doing it, which feels really silly saying that out loud, but I feel like so my fiance's name is John, and like our process has like evolved so much collaboratively. Now we have a very similar process as I have to, writing my own solo stuff. And I think those pillars of being willing to just try new things and see where it goes that's like the biggest one that we have really been leaning into. I think also just like being really intentional about the decisions you make, because I had mentioned earlier how I'm like an improvisatory person and like what I usually improvise just is what happens and there's not a ton of changes and stuff. I think that's great until lyric writing becomes involved. And when I was younger, the lyrics that I wrote when I was younger were very much like on the way to the studio, write them out and record them. And that was it. And I was very not intentional. But that to me felt like freeing almost because it was a contrast to being so intentional with the concert composition. Now I'm like very intentional with my lyrics because I think for me, like lyricism is like kind of defining what you want to say as an artist, which sounds kind of silly, but because there are a bunch of bands that just write lyrics that don't really have a lot of meaning to them or to maybe like the general audience, but like they do have a lot of meaning, I feel like they always carry meaning. And for me, like what I want to say, I really didn't know what I wanted to say for a long time. I was like, what do I really have to say as an artist? I don't know. So I had to like unpack that and think about the kind of themes and threads that follow me throughout my life. And so now I feel like my lyric writing is very, very intentional. So I feel like those pillars definitely bleed into the other aspects of, collaborative writing and songwriting, especially, for sure.
Was there a specific moment you feel where, I mean, I think what you're saying about writing lyrics is very interesting. Again, because that's not anything I do, so I'm very curious about it. Do you feel like there was a specific moment that where you made that kind of shift and pivot, like, oh, I need to be more intentional about this, as
Yes.
opposed to the way that you were kind of working before?
Definitely. There was a specific moment. Really, like I listened back to any of the lyrics I wrote with Blank Slate pre 2019, and which I think we started releasing music in 2016. And I mean, all of those lyrics like mean a lot to me, but like just the way that they came about was very much like, I got to make this line rhyme. And I think this song is about like this blanket thing, but I'm not really sure. And that's like, I was young and figuring it out, but it didn't really feel like I didn't feel super connected to those lyrics. And so the shift for me, I was at University of Michigan studying, I think it was my first year, and I was in a composition lesson with my mentor, Kristen Custer, and she asked me, she was like, do you write poetry? And I was like, yeah, I it's been a really long time since I've written poetry, but like I do. And she was like, I want you to come to the lesson next week with a poem. And I was like, okay. And I was really like, I was almost kind of scared to write a poem. She she wanted me to show it to her, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to say and what I wanted to write about, and that was just her only assignment. And so I thought about that for a while because I was like, I don't know what I want to say as an artist. I feel like everyone that I look up to has something to say. Like they have a really profound like lesson or story, and I just didn't feel like my experiences like had things to say. I mean, I've been on a podcast before and I had no idea what to say. I was so nervous. It was a completely different experience. This was like, when I was young, but like even just thinking back to what I would have thought then when you asked me to be on this podcast versus now, I would have been like, what am I going to say for 2 hours? Like that's a lot. I don't
Yeah.
like what. And so I feel like I really had to confront like why I was asking myself that question. And I think it was because I didn't really believe that I had much to say. Like I just didn't really feel like what I had to say was like important to other people as an artist, which sounds really sad and kind of dark, but that was the kind of mindset that I had been in. So I was like, okay, we got to reframe this because you do have something to say.
Right.
We just got to figure out what that is. And so I wrote a lot of poetry that year. I also did the Artist's Way. I don't know if have you ever done the Artist's Way?
We might need another hour to talk about this. So, because you asked, and as a side note, because this is about you, but my university that I did my undergrad at did not have a composition program. So,
Oh wow.
But I was very interested in composing. So one of the ways that I kind of circumvented that situation was the university did they awarded undergraduate research fellowships, and I applied my sophomore year and I got one. And my mentor and I, you had to apply with a mentor, a faculty
Mhm.
member, and we sat down and we were talking about, what is my whole research? What am I going to research? And how can I tie it into composition? And she said, "Do you know this book, The Artist's Way?" And so I have a copy. I don't think I have it like reachable. Sometimes I can like reach to this
Yeah,
bookshelf and pull
me
it
too.
out. I have a copy of The Artist's Way. I spent a whole year with, chapter by chapter, developing compositional exercises out of each chapter. It's like highlighted to hell. It's like
Yes.
tabbed post-its, everywhere. Anyway, yes, that was a very important kind of foundational book for me.
I feel like I literally also could talk about this for now. You probably can't see. I know you're not recording this on video, but remember the collage assignment where you had to like collage like words out of a magazine or something?
Yeah.
I have that sitting like right on my piano. So
That's awesome.
I love that book so much. But yeah, I was also doing that same thing, working with the chapters. I was doing morning pages every day for a year, and I think about 6 months in, something clicked for me, and I was like, this was about when I had started writing my album because there's a song on that album that's called Feels Like Honey, and that was the first song I wrote that was kind of like that bridging the gap between this musical spaces thing. That was like what my vision for it was just like, oh, it'll be a song that I can write that like kind of has classical elements. Like I was really inspired by a bunch of composers at that time, like, Sharon Nova, Sarah Kirkland Snyder, a lot of amazing composers, Tanner Porter, all of those wonderful, wonderful people. Really inspired by them at the time. And so that was kind of my vision for that song. And I look back to those lyrics and I didn't know what I was saying. Like I look back at those lyrics and I truly just was kind of trying to figure it out, I think. And so the second song that I wrote on that album was that was the Meet Me in the Marigolds song, which is the second track on the album. And that was the first time when I wrote lyrics to actually like have a thing to say. Like I knew what I was going to say. I knew what I wanted it to be about. And it was the first time I'd spent more than probably like 20 minutes on some lyrics, which was hard for me at first because I was really scared about saying something. I don't know. I was just nervous to write words and have them be permanent forever on a recording and have them be my words, I feel like words
Yeah.
are very powerful. And so, but yeah, that song was the shift for me, like writing that song and being really intentional about what I wanted to say and how every line kind of like revealed more information to what I was writing about with that particular song, which the topic of the song doesn't really, it's not like groundbreaking or anything, but I wanted to know, okay, if somebody asked me what this song was about or how I was, writing lyrics at the time, like how could I answer that? And so I don't know. I feel like I used to think that lyrics didn't really hold a lot of weight, and I never used to listen to them, especially as a bassist. I just cared about like what harmonically or like rhythmically was happening, but like
Right.
they really hold a ton of weight, and now I only listen to them honestly. Like I feel like my listening has shifted a lot when it comes to songs. That's my very long-winded answer.
No, I love it. And I mean, writing music and putting music in front of an audience as a composer is vulnerable in itself. And
Mhm.
to me, like, obviously I've gotten over that, but the idea of like writing original words as like poetry almost is like ultra terrifying. So
It is.
it's, you know,
It really is. Like it is vulnerable. But it's also beautiful and amazing, and like I really love doing it, but it was definitely something I had to confront, recently. Like, oh, okay, what do I want to say and how am I going to say it and how does it matter?
yeah. I think what you're talking about, like this pressure to say something. I mean, that's something I have experienced. My wife Susanna is also a composer. That's something we talk about a
Yes.
lot. Is like, we want to say something with our and I don't necessarily feel like all composers think about it that way, which is okay. But I don't know. I mean, I think that that kind of desire to contribute to the world really and say something through your art and music. I mean, that speaks to your artistry. And I can really I really appreciate that and hearing how it's all come together so far.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I think it's important, and I feel like, being able to say whatever it is, it can be anything, but
Yeah.
whatever you need to say as an artist, like, and I think it's even harder to communicate without lyrics sometimes. I mean, I especially even just when I write program notes, I'm like, what am I writing here? Like, what is this piece about? What, like, it confronts a lot. Like, I feel like words
Yeah.
confront a lot of things, and I definitely find that in the concert space, for me, it's way more difficult than having lyrics, but it's it's a fun time.
So I want to, I kind of put a mental pin in something you said a little while ago, and you kind of touched on this idea of community, and you did that, talking about representation and that sort of thing. But I want to dig a little deeper into this, and can you discuss the role of community connection in your music making in general? Because I'm sure it's not just being representative of women bass players, for example, like we've talked about before.
Oh yeah. I keep saying this, I'm sorry. But like however many years ago, I would have been like, "Oh, I don't really like think about community very much, and I don't really, I didn't really feel like connected to I did feel connected to many communities, but it was different than what I had thought. Like I was
Yeah.
really trying to be a part of this concert classical space, and I do have a wonderful community in that space. It's wonderful. But at the time when I was younger, I was really searching for that. I felt like going to school and, collaborating with other performers and musicians and everything, like that felt fulfilling to me, but I didn't really feel as connected to that community as I did per se, like when, John, my fiance, and I, Blank Slate, that band, would go play shows in a setting that I was very comfortable in at that point. I had been playing shows for, since I was 12. So like I felt really okay and my most me self in like a dive bar playing a show with like all the
Yeah.
other bandmates and members of the other bands and whatnot. And so I was always kind of like fighting that contrast a little bit. Like it did feel kind of like a blatant contrast. And it was more because I feel like in the concert space, like one of the biggest parts of that experience is like listening and being quiet. And when you're in a concert, like you don't clap between movements, and you need to make sure you don't breathe or cough or
Right.
do anything loud. It's kind of overwhelming.
It's
I
stressful.
always was just like thinking about like how loud am I breathing? Like, can anyone hear like me sneeze? Like what? I don't know. And you want to get the perfect recording. So it's like
Right.
you want to make sure that I don't know. There's a lot of I have a whole rant on that. I think it's totally actually amazing, but I feel like you can go both ways with it. Some people really don't like that, some people really do. But I found myself in the beginning when I was younger to be more focused on like, oh, I don't want to make a noise. And then I like would kind of be outside of the music itself. But after a while I just kind of got over that, and I like got really into deep listening, and being in a concert hall is and hearing some awesome like new music piece is like one of the coolest things ever. It's been forever since I've done that. But I feel like now like community is like one of the most important parts of my existence as an artist, and like it really took finding the right collaborators for me, songwriting, but also in the concert space to really feel that way. And I think also I just moved to Austin, Texas a year ago with my fiance, and truly like I didn't know what to expect, but I love the community here. And this is the first place that I felt like I am home and like
Yeah.
I don't want to leave. And I have like we have so many amazing musician friends that do so many cool different like things in both the concert music space and also in the I don't know multi-genre space. And so it's just like one of the best like things that could have happened to us was moving here, and really just realizing that we have so many awesome friends doing so many cool things. We go to shows all the time and all different sorts of music and things. And I think this was the first year that I really realized how important community is in my life, because I was always moving around and like, oh, I'm going to go to school at this school, and then I'm going to go to the school at this school. And then at the time after my master's, I did try to go do a PhD. I didn't end up getting into the program I wanted to go to. So I didn't end up doing that. But I wanted to move, to New York or New Jersey or whatever. Like that was kind of my next move in my head. And I was kind of lonely, like in all those spaces that I was
Yeah.
in the past. And I think it's because I didn't really put in the work to realize that community was like really important. And when I was at Michigan, even though it was online, that was the part that was really sad. It was online. So meeting friends was really hard, but I found like one of the collaborators that I work with all the time for Feels Like Honey. His name's Grayson Jarvis. We became friends through that program, and like we're probably gonna write songs forever because like we just as collaborators it's awesome. And I met some really amazing friends there that like I think you go into a master's or a program and you're like, I'm going to get this commission or ensemble, read my piece or whatever. But like, I met some amazing friends that like will forever be people that I can like trust to help with just like being there for me in the creative process and then in life and everything. And I don't know, community is like so important to me. It really was not a few years ago. I really didn't understand or place a lot of value on it because I was moving around so much. But now I feel like it's just such an integral part of like who I am as an artist, especially like collaboratively, you know.
I feel the need to point out something you just kind of said. You mentioned you putting in the work to foster a community, but it goes both ways, right? Like the only way that you can do that is if it's reciprocated from the community itself. And
Yes.
that's been something
Yes.
that has been very interesting, as I too have kind of, been in grad school and then remained in that community and then moved away to a different place, and, trying to insert myself as an artist and not always, not necessarily not feeling welcome, but just like, oh, there's enough of you, like that kind of
Yes.
feeling. It's
Totally.
just, it's just it's very interesting, and it's something, again, it's like one of those things no one ever really teaches us, talks about. Yeah.
No. And it's true because I feel like that mentality of like, oh, there's enough for you, like that is everywhere. I have also been, and I have to say, I know I've been kind of like slightly leaning one-sided on this, but like even in the rock band or whatever I would call my other space thing, like there's people like that there too. I've gone to hangs and I'm like, I do not feel welcome here. Like it seems like there's enough bassists for this particular group. Okay, like and or style of music, whatnot. Like I've been there in every single like space, and that's a hard thing. I mean, it really is, and I feel like that's why I just feel like community in general, like being supportive of that and being willing to like try to create your own or try to like invite people into your space is so important because a lot of people don't do that. I mean, it stems more away from the classical, like it's everywhere,
Right. Exactly. You've already mentioned the artist's way, which I'm sure might be included as part of your answer to my next question, but kind of opening things up in a more broad sense. What is a piece of music or a song, a book, piece of art, any sort of artistic object or set of artistic objects, or even an experience that kind of changed the way you thought about your work, maybe even changed your life, your creative life, or your life?
Yeah. My answer was definitely the artist way.
Yeah.
So
Awesome.
I can think about probably something else a little bit too. I feel like so the artist way definitely changed my life in like in the intentionality I think behind my art, and then also like being in touch with that like child, like the inner child. I know I mentioned I keep going back to like Hannah 5 years ago or like Hannah when I was young or whatever, but I really do like feel like I live my life and I think like I write a thing or like I do something and I'm like, would 10-year-old me be proud of this right now? Like how would 10-year-old me feel or however like whatever age? I feel like probably 12 would maybe be more accurate in my
Yeah.
case, but because that's when I started playing the bass, but and like truly that's like the question, that's the bar that I raise for myself in that regard. Like would 12-year-old Hannah be like stoked about this or would she be like, I don't know. So that's like I feel like the artist way changed my life in that way. And then if I wanted to think about like a piece of music okay, my other thought, I guess it would be the album, not really a specific like song off the album, but the album Penelope by Sarah Kirkland Snyder
Yeah.
also definitely changed my life. That was the first album that I had ever heard that like I was like, oh my gosh, somebody's doing like an indie kind of style in the classical scene. And then I, went down the rabbit hole of like, discovered like Bryce Dessner's music, like part of the National, like artists that are like creating music in the spaces that I wanted to be a part of or were interested in being a part of. I feel like definitely Penelope, that album in particular, was like a huge inspiration to me just because it was the first time I'd ever heard something like that and realized like, oh, you can do this. Like, that's crazy. I've only been like writing, like stuff that I have heard before, like, inspired by things that I've heard before. So yeah, I really love that album. It's very near and dear to my heart.
Yeah. It's good stuff. So, we've talked a lot about all the different kinds of music that you make, and you kind of live in all these different worlds. But you're not just a musician. You make like jewelry, you make visual art. You're just like a really I hesitate to say like a Renaissance artist because that seems cliche, but you do a lot of different you work within a lot of different creative modes. So I'm curious to know more about your visual art, especially. What was this an interest of yours kind of prior to music, in tandem with music, or is it something more recent maybe?
I've always been like a really mediocre interest, like, or mediocre artist in the sense where I've always loved doing the visual art thing, but I like never really really dove into it.
Mm,
Um, my paintings are terrible, but they're so much fun. I used to always paint when I was like younger with my mom. That was something that we did together a lot, and I would always look forward to like going to Michael's and picking out like a birdhouse to paint or like a canvas and paint with my mom. And I used to one of my best friends from I've known her since I was 6. She's an amazing like graphic designer, but she also does like a bunch of visual art. So her and I would always do art together, but I was always just not very good at it, which was okay with me because it was just a fun thing that I didn't really like feel like I had to be good at, I guess.
Yeah.
And it was just enjoyable. And so I've always I'm literally just playing with my rings that I'm wearing right now. I always have to be doing something with my hands, always. Like I'm constantly just moving my hands in any way that I can. And so that has always been like a way to do that for me. When I got older, like when I started making jewelry, it was just more of a fun thing. Like I think I started with resin, which is a whole conversation because I don't work with it anymore. Resin is very toxic. I
Mm.
did not know this when we first started working with it. I used it in my apartment bedroom and it emits fumes and yeah, it's not don't do resin unless you've done your research because I did not. I used it for like a few years and I didn't know that it was like toxic until I did more research. So point being, I started with resin and I just posted some of the necklaces on my Instagram story and was like, would anyone want one of these? And a bunch of people did. So I was like, well, maybe I should try to, do this more often. And I did it through the pandemic. So I'm trying to remember. I think I stopped using resin itself in 2022. But to kind of tie it back to your question of how does it, have you done it forever? Like, how does it relate to your other art? Like, I never thought it related to music at all. I had no connection to it in my brain until I was at a summer festival and one of the faculty asked me, I think she had seen one of my resin pieces on the wall and this was Nirmali Fen. And she was like, what is that? Like, what is that you're doing here? Like, can you tell me more about that thing? And so I did. And she was like, you create your music exactly the same way as you created that resin piece. Because the resin piece was like a bunch of layers. I had to layer what you want the front facing matter to be. And then you put a layer of color resin inside and all the sparkles and things. And then you put a layer of the finishing touch or something. And I think I explained that in the process. And she was like, that's exactly how you write your music. And I was like, what? This is so weird. I do layer tracks. I'm very much like a track layerer. I have to tell myself to take things away. I love big sounds and things. And so I've never thought of it like that. I've never really connected the two of them together until she mentioned that. And now I feel like I do look at the resin stuff that I used to make and a lot of it is very I don't know. It does feel like me. Like the more I look at it, I'm like, okay, this kind of makes sense. And I like thinking about visual art as another representation of, our identities and such. But I stopped using resin back then. Now I do I just make polymer clay jewelry. I make little paintings out of clay. It's so much fun. But yeah, I mean, I don't paint as much as I used to, but I still enjoy it here and there. And I would say it's kind of connected, but not. It's loosely connected. I feel like to the rest of my art.
So I was kind of a little deliberate in asking you the last question as a lead in for my next question because I'm really curious about how you answer it. But something I ask everyone that I'll ask you now is, what do you think you would be doing if it wasn't your art? So composing, performing, making jewelry, visual art. Like if all of that was kind of out of the equation, there's a fork in the road that took you elsewhere. What do you think that would be?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Okay. So I thought about this, and my first answer was just I can't imagine a world where I wouldn't be doing that stuff. But then I thought about it further. And I was like, okay, if I really had to answer this question, I feel like I would be a chef. I love cooking.
Oh,
It's it's one of my favorite things. I feel like of course it ties into the artist thing because how could it not? But when I cook dishes that I'm just experimenting with, I'm not a trained chef or anything. I just like cooking food. It's fun. I like making food that tastes good and giving food to people. And it's one of my favorite things to do. And hosting gatherings and cooking food is so much fun for me. But I feel like I realized I got really into it during the pandemic when I couldn't compose anything. And I think it was another way to tell myself oh, you can create things and make mistakes and it's okay. You can just let go because I could make a meal that I would burn in the oven or I could make a meal that tasted terrible or I could make a loaf of bread that didn't rise or whatever, and it wasn't like, I didn't feel like it was a moral failing.
Yeah.
And that was like the first time I realized, I was like, okay, there's something here. We got to explore. We got to unpack that a little bit. And so I feel like I took that philosophy and moved it to my art, but I really, really got into cooking. Like when I wasn't able to play on stage and when I just couldn't write concert music as much as I used to. I just wasn't in the right headspace for it. I really was like into cooking. So I feel like if I wasn't able to do any of those things, like running my own little restaurant would be so much fun, or like being a chef or something like that, and like really taking pride in my work. Like I feel like that would be fun. Whenever you like go to a restaurant and there's like a chef that is really excited about like the food that they make, it's like one of the most fun things ever. It's so awesome.
Yeah, I've been fortunate enough to become acquaintances and even friends with some chefs, and like hearing them talk. And I feel this way, like I'm sure you've watched like Chef's Table on Netflix.
Yes.
And
yes,
right now The Bear is like the big
Yep.
show that everyone's talking about. We love that show.
I haven't seen it yet.
It's great. It's really stressful, but in like a really artistic way. So that's all I'll say about that.
Yes.
But in talking about what chefs like these chefs do, or hearing them talk about what they do on like these Chef's Table documentary style series, I just find it so inspiring as a composer. And it's like a connection that I don't think a lot of people ever really think. I think a lot of people think about food in like a very utilitarian way, for example, so they don't make that connection. But it is an art form, and it's an art form beyond just like the artistically plating something. For example, like you see those incredible like Michelin star, like, what is this food kind of things.
Right, like
but yeah, but it's like it's deeper than that, of course. So
I feel like there's so much love that goes into it, it's like it's so much, it is an art, and it's very, I don't know, it's very like heartwarming, I feel like.
Though I think it might be more stressful than being a composer. So
I know. It really would be. Like, it really, really would be. But yeah, I think it'd be fun to just have a little restaurant, like maybe in a small town or something, make it a little low stakes, but
is there a tool that you use in your practice, and that could be your performance practice or your composition practice, that you think everyone should know about and that everyone else could benefit from?
I don't know. I know that this is not how everyone operates. So this is really just an answer for like, I've had a lot of conversations with other composers about this, but it kind of ties back into what we were talking about before with how like I used to thrive on procrastination and anxiety to like finish a piece. I know a lot of other people like that who are still in that headspace and still rely on that headspace to be able to get to the finish line. And I think the tool that like is most helpful for me to kind of get out of that hole that I put myself in sometimes would be to just like check in with your mental state during the piece. It's really important to like go outside and like to, get exercise and take care of yourself and all these things that I feel like as artists, a lot of times it's like glorified or like romanticized that we don't take care of ourselves. And that especially just like the image of the composer or the creative that just like needs to have, your rights about things that are really difficult. I think I talk about this a lot with John, actually, like the idea that like you have to like struggle to write something good, or like, especially with lyrics, like lyric writing, a lot of people talk about the idea of like the struggle to like create the thing. And I feel like for me, I really don't think it has to be that way. Once I realized that it doesn't have to be that way, I'm very much a proponent of like, take care of yourself and try to check in with your mental state and give yourself some space. And I know there's like, that's a luxury that sometimes we don't have if we have a deadline and whatnot. But even like if the piece is due tomorrow and I'm freaking out, I will like go for a walk, or I'll bake a cake, or I'll like do something to just kind of like, a small gesture of like, gotta take care of yourself because, you are the thing that is creating the thing. And I think that's the one tool, which I guess isn't really like a compositional tool now that I think about it. But it's helpful. It was helpful for me to realize that, like, in that, I don't know, the mentality of that really informs my creative practice. So that would be the first thing that came to mind.
Well, it's certainly something that composers should be thinking about more, and thinking
Yeah.
about in a guilt, like doing so in a guilt-free way. Like it's okay to, it's we're not operating on like people's brains, right? Like so it's all pretty low pressure in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, and I feel like if I would think of an actual like compositional tool, I learned this from a mentor a few years ago, but just being able to show up every day in some capacity. And I feel like that kind of relates to, like, you and I talked about how, like, stepping away from a piece, like, and just spending time thinking about it. I feel like that also counts as showing up. So being able to just like offer something, whether it's 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever, maybe it's 2 seconds, some form of thought or, idea or whatnot into a piece, and kind of like unraveling a little bit more as you go. That is like something that really helped me, because I very much was a not showing up every day type girly. I was
Yeah.
show up when I need to, and that's it. And now I think it's like you gotta there's a balance.
Yeah, I dig it. My final question is your chance to really talk about whatever you want to. So, what is something that you've never had a chance to say about your art that you've always wanted to share with people?
I think we were kind of talking about this, and I probably have said this before, but I do feel like all of the different spaces and the visual art and whatnot, like all the things, even the cooking and the creating in whatever way, like I think all those things really do inform each other, and like in a way that just like my identity is me, but also like my music is my identity. And I feel like that is that's the answer I have to that. I'm trying to think of anything else, but I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. It's good stuff. Hannah, this has been so much fun. It's been so great getting to actually talk to you for once, and first of all, and get to learn more about the way you think about music, and just really, I really appreciate your time today. It's been so good.
Thank you so much for having me. I like really appreciate it, and it's been so much fun, and it's been fun getting to know you as well a little bit. I want to like have another conversation and ask you all these questions.
Yeah, anytime. Just let me know.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
So for real, Hannah is right. I think we could have talked a lot longer, and I expect we'll sit down again later on in the future. Hannah and her music can be found online at hannahboissonneault.com. I'll have a link to that in the show description and show notes. Also, her website acts as a sort of hub for her various projects and bands that she's involved with, and that'll lead you to all the places that you can listen to her music, her band's music, all of that stuff. I'm Tyler Kline, and thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Music Maker. Music Maker with Tyler Kline is a production of Loose Leaf Transmissions, made for all ears. We're online at looseleaftransmissions.com, and that's where you can find more episodes of the podcast, as well as ways to support Music Maker and the Loose Leaf Transmissions network. That'll do it for this episode of the podcast. Until next time, take care, and I'll see you here for the next episode.